It was a calm evening in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. For Thomas, life had always seemed perfect. He had the family, the job, and the house that anyone could dream of. His wife, Rachel, was the love of his life, his partner, his confidant, the woman he'd trusted with his heart, and the mother of their 2 children. Or so he thought. Thomas had been working long hours at the office, often coming home late, but Rachel always greeted him with a smile. It seemed like a normal life, with its little struggles and everyday ups and downs. But recently, there had been something different about Rachel. She had become distant. Her once warm affection had started to wane. At first, Thomas brushed it off as the stress of raising their 2 young kids and maintaining a household. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Late one night, Thomas found a letter buried deep in the back of their bedroom drawer. The envelope wasn't addressed to him. It was from an unfamiliar name, someone Rachel had never mentioned before. It was enough to send a chill down his spine. The words were written in a rush, almost as if the sender was too eager to get them off their chest. It wasn't just an innocent note, it was a confession, one that would unravel everything Thomas thought he knew about his marriage. The letter spoke of a secret affair, a betrayal that shook Thomas to his core. His heart raced as he reread the letter, each word sinking deeper into his gut. His wife, his beloved Rachel, had been unfaithful to him. The words felt like a slap in the face. How could she? How could the woman he had trusted, the woman who had vowed to stand by him through thick and thin, betray him in such a cruel way? In that moment, Thomas knew he had to confront her. But not yet. He wasn't going to allow her to get away with this so easily. He needed proof. The letter, while damning, was just words. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. And that's when the idea hit him. Thomas had heard stories of people using DNA tests to uncover hidden truths. People had exposed affairs, discovered long-lost children, and even proven paternity with these tests. Why not apply it to his own situation? If Rachel had been unfaithful, he would need irrefutable evidence. He couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. The next day, Thomas arranged for a DNA test, not for himself, but for Rachel. He needed to be sure. To prepare for what he was about to uncover, he meticulously planned everything. He had to remain calm, composed. If Rachel found out about the test before he was ready, she could cover her tracks. So, Thomas kept his secret tight, even though his stomach churned with anticipation. Days passed as he anxiously awaited the results. He kept up the charade, pretending everything was fine, sharing small talks over dinner, playing with the kids. But behind those eyes was a storm brewing, a storm that was about to destroy everything in its path. He couldn't wait much longer. The lies, the deceit, it all had to come to an end. Finally, the day arrived. Thomas sat in his car, gripping the envelope with the results of the DNA test. He could feel his hands trembling, sweat beading on his forehead as he stared at the unopened paper. The moment of truth had arrived. There was no turning back. He walked inside. Rachel was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner. She didn't know that the quiet evening they were about to share would soon turn into an emotional confrontation. As Thomas stood in the doorway, the weight of the moment bore down on him. He had so many questions, so many emotions swirling inside him, but he had to remain steady. He had to expose the truth. Rachel turned, smiling as she saw him. "Hey, honey. Long day?" "Not as long as the one I'm about to have," Thomas replied, his voice steady, though his insides were anything but. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered for a moment, the slightest shift in her expression, but she quickly regained her composure. "Of course, what's going on?" Thomas stepped forward, holding the envelope out to her. "What is this?" He handed it to her, and her eyes widened as she saw what it was. Her fingers gripped the edge of the envelope, but she didn't open it. Her breath caught in her throat, and Thomas could see her trying to maintain her calm facade. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice shaking slightly. I don't know what this is. What do you mean? Oh, you know exactly what it is, Thomas said, his voice low and controlled, his heart pounding in his chest. I've seen the letter, Rachel. I know everything. The color drained from her face, and she swallowed hard, her eyes darting away for a brief moment. But Thomas wasn't finished. He wasn't going to let her off the hook. I know about the affair, Rachel. I know about him. Rachel's expression shifted from shock to guilt, and in that moment, Thomas saw the cracks in her perfect disguise. Thomas, please, she began, but her words trailed off as she realized the game was up. Don't please me. I want the truth, Thomas demanded, his voice unwavering, her eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent for a long moment. Thomas could feel the tension in the room thickening, but he wouldn't back down. He wasn't going to let her spin her lies any longer. Rachel finally opened the envelope, her hands trembling, and scanned the results. Her face turned pale as she read the findings. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered, her voice cracking. I never wanted to hurt you, Thomas. It just happened. I'm sorry. Thomas could feel his heart shatter as the weight of her words settled in. She hadn't just betrayed him once. She had betrayed him with calculated intent, knowing full well the consequences of her actions. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had torn apart everything they had built together, but just as Thomas was about to speak, a knock on the door interrupted the moment. The doorbell rang once more. The figure standing outside was a stranger, a tall man with a somber look on his face, holding a package. Thomas glanced at Rachel, who seemed even more shaken now. As the man stepped into the room, he handed Thomas a small box. This is for you, sir, he said, his tone professional, almost detached. Thomas opened it, and inside, there was a second set of documents. A different kind of DNA test. This time, it was not Rachel's results, but the identity of the man she had been seeing. The name on the paper was one that Thomas recognized immediately. It was the same man who had written the letter, the one who had been involved with his wife. Everything came crashing down at once. The betrayal had not just been emotional, it had been planned, executed with cold precision. And now, the truth was laid bare before him. There would be no more secrets, no more lies. The final act of deception had been exposed, and the consequences were beyond what either of them could have imagined. The moment that seemed like an end, was only the beginning of the destruction that had been set in motion. The door clicked shut behind him, and as Thomas stood in the cold night air, a sense of emptiness enveloped him. It was almost as if the world had gone silent. The cacophony of his thoughts, the heavy burden of emotions, the disbelief, it all seemed to fade away as he looked up at the night sky. There was no star bright enough to offer him comfort. Nothing seemed to make sense anymore. He had been betrayed by the one person he trusted more than anyone, the one person he thought would always have his back. But in the blink of an eye, that trust was shattered. He couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. How had it all come to this? Had there been signs? Had he been blind to Rachel's growing distance? He had been so caught up in his work, in the routine of everyday life, that he had missed the warning signs. The quiet changes, the late nights out, the distant look in her eyes. Had he truly been too focused on his career to see what was happening right under his nose? Maybe. But no amount of self-reflection could change the fact that he was standing on the precipice of a life he no longer recognized. Thomas didn't even know where he was going as he walked through the neighborhood. His mind was consumed by the whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, betrayal, but there was one feeling that lingered longer than the rest: betrayal. It was a cold, bitter feeling that gnawed at him from the inside. The kind of betrayal that cuts deep into your soul, leaving scars that never quite healed. He knew Rachel would try to convince him to stay. She would promise to change, to work things out, to make it right. But he had learned enough in that moment to understand that her words were hollow. She had already made her choice. She had chosen him over her family. And that choice would haunt him for the rest of his life. As Thomas walked, he saw the dim light of a late-night diner ahead. His stomach growled, but it wasn't hunger that pushed him forward, it was the need for distraction. He needed to get away from the house, away from the overwhelming thoughts that threatened to swallow him whole. Walking through the door of the diner, he was greeted by the hum of quiet conversations, the clink of silverware on plates, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee. The world inside seemed like a strange contrast to the chaos swirling in his mind. The waitress, a woman with a friendly smile and a kind face, noticed the tension in his posture as he slid into a booth by the window. "Coffee?" she asked gently, as though she recognized a man in pain. Thomas nodded. He needed something, anything, to ground him in the present. He stared out the window as the night sky darkened, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty streets. His thoughts wandered back to Rachel, to the devastation she had caused. And yet, beneath the hurt, there was an undeniable sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like years, Thomas realized he didn't have to stay in that toxic relationship. He was free. He had been shackled to a lie, but now, the truth was out. There was no more pretending. No more waking up each day wondering whether Rachel's love was real, or if it was just another facade. He had been living a lie, and now he was done. When the coffee arrived, Thomas stared into the dark, steaming cup, trying to quiet his racing mind. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the cup, bringing it to his lips. The bitter taste was a reminder of the bitterness that had taken root in his life. But somehow, it felt cleansing. The warmth of the drink spread through him, offering a momentary sense of peace amid the chaos. As he sat in the diner, he couldn't help but think about the future. What now? What did life look like after all of this? How would he explain it to their kids? How would he rebuild the shattered pieces of his life? There were so many questions, so many uncertainties. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to have all the answers right away. It would take time, time to heal, time to figure out the next steps, time to rebuild. But that was okay. The ringing of his phone broke his thoughts. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Rachel. Of course. It was too soon for her to accept the reality. She wouldn't give up that easily. But Thomas wasn't ready to speak to her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He silenced the phone and let it ring until it stopped. The silence that followed felt oddly comforting. It was his moment of solitude, a moment where he didn't have to pretend everything was okay. The world could wait. He needed time to process everything. A part of him wished he could go back in time, back to when things were simpler, when Rachel had been the person he thought she was. But that was impossible. What was done was done. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself lost in thought, his mind swirling in a haze of memories and questions. He thought about the man behind the affair, the one who had been so callous as to invade the life he had built with Rachel. But most of all, he thought about Rachel herself. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. But even as the bitterness and anger swirled within him, there was a sense of clarity. He was no longer trapped in the dark web of lies she had spun around him. The truth had set him free, even if it had come at a terrible cost. There was no more pretending. No more pretending that their marriage was salvageable. No more pretending that she was the person he thought she was. As the diner began to empty out, Thomas paid his bill and left, stepping back into the cold night air. He felt like a different man now. A man who had been broken and betrayed but who had also gained something invaluable, his freedom. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The emotional scars would take time to heal, and there would be moments when he'd question everything. But in that moment, standing on the sidewalk, Thomas knew one thing for certain: he was going to be okay. He would rebuild. He would reclaim his life, piece by piece. And this time, it would be on his terms. The nightmare was over, and the healing had only just begun.